Hey everyone, welcome to today's class in Intro to Political Science. Today we're going to be talking about political culture, political participation, and political socialization. Political culture we've already been talking about a little bit in terms of ideology, but we're going to go a little bit deeper on it today, or a little bit broader. Political participation is something that we're going to start talking about today, but we'll be returning to multiple times throughout the semester as we start looking at different forms of government types. And then political socialization is something when we looked at the psychology of ideology, we looked at kind of the psychological side. Today, we're going to look at it in general. And then next class, we're going to look at it from the perspective of kind of the social environment. How does the social environment impact our political beliefs? So here are the learning objectives that we have for today, so you can read through them. All right, so first, what is political culture? So the fundamental political values, beliefs, and orientations that are widely held within a political community. So in some ways, it's similar to what we might think of as ideology. Ideology would be an example of something that would make up part of political culture, but it can be broader as well, right? So you could talk about like a Canadian political culture where there may be multiple different ideologies within the society. So you could say, you know, this Canadian political culture versus American political culture versus British political culture. So what are the values, beliefs, and orientations, political orientations that are widely held within the Canadian political community? Each country has a particular political culture based on factors uh, such as the characteristics of the population, its history, and its political experiences. So the political culture of a community is shaped by its experiences together. So partially the characteristics of the population themselves. So what are, you know, their particular beliefs? It could be based on their individual psychology, but mainly based on the history and political experiences of the population. So what have they been through together? And then their orientation toward the world is shaped by the things that they've been through. Um, so if we look, something that we'll return to in a second, but if we look at Canada versus the US, when we want to compare their political culture, we might look at what are the differences in the Canadian and American experience, and how have those produced differences in how Canadians and Americans see the world. Now, there's a lot of, if we look at political culture, there's a lot of similarities between Canada and the US, for example, and between Canada and the UK. But there are some differences, and a lot of these differences we would view in terms of small differences in their history, uh, or our history, and our political experiences. There's also different subcultures based on class, ethnicity, linguistics, religion, region, gender, or generational groupings. So we could talk about, for example, say Quebec versus English Canada having different regional political cultures, or Western Canada or Atlantic Canada having their own political cultures. And that would develop based on their own history and their own political experiences that may be different from, you know, Canada as a whole. Um, so particularly in larger countries like Canada, the US, Russia, you'd be more likely to see kind of differences in regional political culture. Political culture based on religion, so kind of groups that share characteristics in being believers in a particular religion, that would shape their political values and their political beliefs as well based on the teachings of their religion. It can be based on a shared sense of ethnicity or language. So again, for Canadian context, in terms of language, so we often talk about kind of the difference between Quebec and the rest of Canada, but there would also be a difference between Francophones and the rest of Canada. And not while the majority of Francophones are in Quebec, there would also be uh, uh, many in Atlantic Canada, in particular, New Brunswick, in parts of Ontario and parts of Manitoba. You'd have large clusters, and then you'd have Francophone Canadians spread out through the rest of provinces as well. So you could also talk about kind of a Francophone political culture within Canada. Um, ethnicity, so based on different political experiences of different ethnic groups. So some of this may relate to things like racism, um, and so kind of a different ethnic consciousness for groups that have suffered persecution or oppression, and then similarly class. So you're most likely to see kind of a political culture develop among the lower classes, kind of a sense of what political values and beliefs should be based on kind of an experience of poverty or of marginalization or not having your voice heard. But there would also be kind of an upper class one in terms of um, political beliefs, say being more about the state not interfering or not redistributing. Um, so in terms of the beliefs of what the um, government owes to people around it, and what it should be the role of the government, whether you're upper class, middle class, or lower class, you're going to likely to have kind of based on your experience, different beliefs about what it is the government should be doing for you. So one way to describe the political culture of political community is in terms of its dominant ideological perspective and the fundamental politically relevant values. So what values are important and what is the dominant ideological perspective. Now don't forget, so when we're talking about ideology, there's definitely a split between, within any country between different perspectives, but they're still based on what we talked about in our first class on ideology. There's still in most states be kind of a dominant ideological perspective. And then it's the ideological fight is between how far left and how far right do we go there. So is it democratic socialism that your state has? If you're social democracy, how far left? So how much liberalism should be in there and how much socialism should be in there. So there's still likely to be kind of a dominant ideological perspective. And then the fight is how far off of that should we be? Maybe proponents of kind of like neighboring on the left-right continuum, neighboring ideological perspectives. Theorists also offer different explanations for the differences between Canadian and American political culture. So in many ways, our ideologies, our political culture are very similar. And Hartz's fragment theory explains that Canada and the United States are liberal fragments in which individual freedoms are paramount. So we're liberal democratic countries where kind of individual freedom is at the core of our political beliefs, our political culture, the dominant ideological perspective. So there's a strong element of liberalism, particularly kind of the liberalisms that allow for some form of social support at the core of both the Canadian and American political belief set. Where there's a little bit of a difference is in terms of more of a Tory touch in Canada, which argues that liberalism is not the only significant ideological perspective in Canada. So when the US was formed, there were many people who opposed leaving the British or leaving Britain. And many of them then moved north, kind of the loyalists moved north to Canada. And so they brought with them kind of this touch of even greater affinity or conservatism, attachment to the monarchy. And so with that was kind of this element within Canadian political culture that didn't put liberalism, not necessarily saying that individual freedom is not very important, but it's not the only thing that's important. And we see a little bit of that in terms of the difference between Canada and the US when it comes to socialism, where Canada has been more open to socialist elements or social democracy than the States. Part of that we could see is that there's almost a fragmentation or there's an openness to liberalism not being the only ideological perspective within Canada. And then Lipset argues that differences between Canada and the US are based on different historical perspectives. So if, for example, if we look at the formation of both countries, because the formation of your country is going to have an importance uh, for kind of the shared historical experiences. And in the US was born out of revolution, where Canada was born out of kind of peaceful um, development, right? So it was a gradual process, step by step, but there was, other than a few kind of riots or small rebellions, very, very little violence. So it was a gradual, slow, peaceful process. Um, and so particularly in the case of the US, we see that in an openness to the idea of revolution, but also violence achieving political aims. A greater open to that, a greater openness to, say, guns as necessary to protect yourself and the country. Um, and and in Canada, more of a deference to authority. We see that in kind of the Canadian perspective of kind of gradual working, not to overthrow authority, but to work together with them in a slow process of change. So we often talk about a democratic political culture, so that, a political culture that's necessary for democracy to survive in a country. So there's often been an argument when we look at countries that have failed when establishing kind of democratic institutions in the country. Some countries still, despite having elections, have trouble setting up a proper functioning liberal democracy. They have elections, but other than that, it looks a lot like authoritarian regime. So why is it that they have trouble establishing a proper functioning democracy? And many have argued that that democracy requires more than institutions, it also requires a democratic political culture. And if you don't have a population and leaders who hold this culture, democracy in and of itself isn't likely to function. And so since democracy is ultimately based on the citizenry, it's suggested that democratic political culture is needed if democracy is to be sustained and meaningful. So unless the citizens of the country hold the democratic values, right, hold the democratic ideology, then they're not going to take the proper steps in terms of participation, but also in terms of holding leadership accountable. That's necessary for a proper functioning democracy. Amended verba make the argument that you need for a successful democratic political culture, you need what they refer to as civic culture, and that it involves a mixture of what's referred to as participant and subject political cultures. And if you have too much participant political culture, there'd be many demands on the government, and so it wouldn't be properly functioning. Subject political cultures are those where somebody is aware of politics, but they don't really have kind of the view that they should or could get involved um, and change politics or affect politics. Where participant political culture is one where you're aware of politics and you try to get involved in making changes. On the surface, we would think that participant political culture would be ideal for democracy. So want people to be involved in politics. We want them participating, and if they see something they don't like, we want them getting involved to change. The idea that when they say that it could lead to instability with too many demands, if people are participating on too many issues all the time, making demands on the government has limited capacity to be able to deal with it. So it could overload the government and make it non-functional. So yes, you need an active, engaged, participating citizenry when it's important, but you also need one that can sit back and say, okay, we've elected this government, now we need to let this government govern. And if they step way out of line, then we get involved. But other than that, we could continue lobbying, we could continue, holding them accountable. We'll certainly, if there's things that we don't like, participate in the following election, but we've also elected these people to a term to do a job, and we need to let them do the job. Now, others would say that active citizen participation is always a good thing. So not everybody agrees on this mixture, this civic culture mixture of subject and participant political culture, where kind of the participation is the most important. I guess that comes down to a little bit of a definition of participant, or how active it is. So there is that divide within kind of scholars over what is the ideal democratic political culture. Politically active and assertive citizenry are also sometimes evident in undemocratic countries. So particularly if we're looking at the lead up to revolt or revolution, you would certainly be seeing an active and assertive citizenry. So participating in politics isn't only unique to democracies. How popular is democracy? So generally, democracy, if you look at in democracies and in non-democracies, if you look at polls, democracy is generally quite popular. So a sample survey in 2017 found that 78% of those questioned agreed that representative democracy was a good way of governing their country. So typically when we look at surveys of democracies, it'll be the most popular form of democracy. But if we dig down a little bit deeper, not always popular or not always loved in and of itself. So majority of people will say, and here 78, so that's a really good score for democracy, that representative democracy is kind of the way to go. But there's also what we're going to look at a little bit soon is that there's also a lot of sometimes distrust in democracies as well. So we think it's best, but we certainly have our problems with it. Canada's political culture is largely based on liberal democratic values. So Canadians, certainly in terms of political culture, are supportive of the idea of liberal democratic values. So a democracy with open participation, equality for everyone, liberty for everyone, government protection for people. But a consensus about general political values is not always matched by a high level of support for those values in practice, right? So there is a disconnect between, if you ask people in a survey, how much do you value this concept, this concept, this concept? And then when it comes time to put a policy in place that uses that value, or where you have to all of a sudden put out, say, tax dollars to pay for that value, and so then a disconnect between the level of support there when it comes to implementing those practices or putting into practice. There may be an openness. For example, Canada has a declared openness, and most people are very proud of the idea of multiculturalism within Canada. But then when it talks about bringing in immigrants who act or speak or look differently, then you get a lot of the people who, you know, publicly or in a poll would say they love multiculturalism, saying, wait, but not these people, or not that many of them. Or there's often a large support for multiculturalism when that multiculturalism is essentially, you know, shared European culture, or where it's for people who, in many ways, you know, speak the same language, behave largely the same way, share your same religion. But the further anybody coming into the country it is different from your views, the less multiculturalism really is something that you support in practice. So attitudes concerning government and politicians. So we've said that people support democracy as kind of a governing form, but how much belief is there within kind of their own government and their own politicians? How much support is for them? How much trust is them? So political efficacy is the attitude that individuals think that they can have an impact on political decisions and that government is responsive to what people want. So how much do you believe that your voice is heard? that if you say something, if you try to participate to get change, that you'll be able to actually have your voice heard and actually affect policy. And typically, political efficacy scores, even in democracies, are quite low, where people don't really believe that their voice is heard. This will depend a lot on which group you are in a democracy. So those, and that's partially why we see different political cultures across different groups. So, for example, wealthier people will typically or should typically have a higher perception of political efficacy than poorer people, right? Richer people often have greater access to the social networks that politicians are in, able to make political donations, potentially able to run for office themselves, have the proper connections, everything like that, where poor people having their voice heard can be more problematic. Now, there's certainly a lot of things that members of all groups can be done or can do to have their voice heard, but it's a lot harder for some people, for certain groups than for others. Public confidence and trust in government has declined in almost all advanced democratic countries in recent decades. So if you ask people how much do you trust the government to do what's right or to kind of like make your life better, the amount of people who would say that they trust the government has steadily been declining over time. Part of the reason for growing distrust is things like political scandals and broken promises. The longer, the more scandals there are and the more times you see the government breaking their promise, it's hard to trust that they're actually going to do what's in your best interest. Citizens are better informed. So there's been scandals and broken promises for years, but now through increasing mass media, increased access to information, we're better aware of the different things that the government does wrong. More educated public has higher expectations. The more people are educated, the better that they typically understand politics, but also the greater expectations they have for the greater demands they have for government to actually be responsive. And as the world has become more and more complicated through processes like globalization, countries have less control over many elements of their own economy and their own kind of territory. And when they have less capacity to control those things, it means that they have less control over being able to satisfy the demands of their population. The world with globalization has also become more complex, with so many more issues arising that they may have to respond to. So with a greater landscape of things to respond to and less ability to control those responses or to control the outcomes after they respond, it leads to more areas where the government can have an unsatisfactory response. So some of these then, if we look at it like reasons for increasing distrust are, you can blame on the government themselves. So broken promises and political scandals are things that that's obviously their own fault. Some of it, though, is because of trends that they may have participated in but have little control over. So growth in mass media isn't something that was caused by the government. More educated citizenry. Government played a role in helping create that, but still that's kind of a historical trend that's been moving for generations. And globalization, while again government played a role in, largely the effects of it are outside of their kind of control. So this is something that they're having to react to rather than something that they've created. So here we have just kind of as an idea, a chart for confidence in national governments in 2012, and it's changed since 2007. So the bars are the level of political trust in 2012, and then whether it's increased or decreased since 2007 is the kind of stars. So if the, or sorry, not stars, if the diamond is above the black line, then it means from 2007 to 2012, trust in government went up. And if it's below the black line, as it is in most cases, trust in government has declined. So the question that people were responding to here was, it was the number of people who answered yes to the following question. In this country, do you have confidence in each of the following or not? And this one was, how about national government? So do you have confidence in national government? And saying yes or no. So in this, for the OECD countries, so these are some of the richest countries in the world, so the most developed, kind of largest democracy countries in the world. So most of them, so the highest looks like about 77% in Switzerland, and then it's hard to read, that Luxembourg, it looks like. In Canada, it's in the 50s, it looks like. But many of them are below 50. Some of them are even below 40, even as low as it looks like under 20 in some cases. So if we look at this, confidence in government is extremely low throughout most advanced democracies. So yes, there's support for democracy. If we look at surveys for, do you think that democracy or representative democracy is the ideal form of government? Absolutely. In terms of how it's implemented in most countries, do you trust that they're doing what's in your best interest? No, not really. The majority of these being under 50%, and then only a couple of them would be over 75% or even above 2/3 who would say that they trust in government. So let's talk a little bit about political participation. So the majority of people in most countries participate in politics at least to the extent of voting in elections. So political participation in general in countries around the world isn't particularly high, but one of the biggest places where you see some form of participation is in democracies. The majority of people at least vote. But election turnout has declined in many democratic countries over generations. So people vote less than they used to. Now, that's not true in all countries. There are some democracies where voting is mandatory. You could be fined or potentially even jailed if you don't vote. So it's the logic for mandatory voting is that you get all of these different rights from being part of a democracy. And so all they really ask in return is pay taxes and take your responsibility to vote and help choose government seriously. And so they try to force us so that they have high level of representation, so everyone kind of has their voice heard. People who would oppose mandatory voting make the argument that not voting can be an expression of your political preferences as well, right? If, for example, no political party is putting forward something that you can support, then not voting could be a political statement in themselves that if you're a free country, if you're a free democratic country, not voting, should be part of your freedom as well. So there is some divide over whether in democracy voting should be mandatory or not. In Canada or the US, it's not. Countries using proportional representation systems tend to have higher voter turnout than those using single member plurality systems. This is something that we'll return to more in the future in terms of what PR versus SMP systems are. But just in short, so Canada, for example, uses a single member plurality system. And so that means if you look at voting in Canada, everybody lives in a riding or in a particular district. And from each riding, there's one member of parliament who is elected. So based on, for example, if you live in Montreal, Montreal is divided up into different ridings. And then, so based on your part of Montreal, you'd be voting to elect one member of parliament. And so usually each of the different political parties have a candidate who's running in that riding, and the person who gets the largest share of the vote, so the plurality of the votes, wins and becomes the member of parliament for that district. But so what's great with, and we'll return to this when we talk more about different forms of democracy, but what's great with an SMP system is that everybody, because it's based on electing your MP at a local kind of district, you have somebody who's representing just your local community, your local district in Parliament. It's, if you need to know who to complain to in Parliament, you know, okay, well, this is my MP, this is the person who I can go to. They understand local issues, they typically live in the community. And so this is somebody who I know I can go talk to try to resolve problems for me. The problem that some people identify with SMP systems is it can lead to strange results. So imagine the country's made up of 10 electoral districts, so 10 ridings, just to simplify it. And there's 3 parties running. And in each riding, one party gets the party with the most votes. So it's a really, really contested election. So 2 parties in each district get 33% of the vote. And then 1 party in each of the 10 districts gets 34% of the vote. So really, really close. That party that got the 34% in each district would get all 10 MPs. So you would have them having 100% of the seats in government, but they only received, across the entire electorate, they only received 34% of the vote. And then you have 2 other political parties who combined had 66% of the vote, get 0 representation in Parliament. Now, that's an extreme scenario. It's very unlikely in all ridings that you'd have something like that happening. But oftentimes you do kind of see patterns of there's one party that just beats out the other one and get a huge portion of the seats. And this helps both multiple political parties in Quebec or in Canada, right? So in Quebec, it benefits often the Liberals or the Bloc, where they just win multiple seats, but are able to carve out, depending on the year, either the Liberals, NDP in one time, and Bloc several times. They have a whole bunch of small victories, but get most of the seats in Quebec. You've seen that with the Liberals, sometimes Conservatives, but particularly Liberals. You've seen that in Ontario, and then Western Canada, provinces like Alberta, you see that for kind of almost a complete sweep by the Conservatives. Not saying that they have run up though near 100% of the vote in each riding. It's just that they managed to just beat out the other parties, but across almost all of the ridings, so they get most of the seats. Proportional representation is based on not off of geographic regions, but just kind of total vote. So everybody votes. If one party gets 33% of the seats, then our vote, they get 33% of the seats. If a party gets 50% of the votes, they get 50% of the seats. If a party gets 2% of the votes, they get 2% of the seats. Typically, we see a higher voter turnout in countries that have proportional representation. Other factors that influence voter turnout include mobilization by well-organized political parties. How well are political parties able to turn out their voters? Countries with high level of political attachment, close electoral races. So the closer it's expected to be, the more people are likely to turn out because they believe that their vote can help influence it. If it's viewed that it's likely going to be a decisive election already, a lot of people will just stay home on potentially both sides because they feel like it's a the results are already decided, so their vote's not really going to matter. And then significant differences between parties. So if you look at the last US election, there are significant differences between both political parties, and that shaped then a higher kind of excitement about, so on the Republican side, for many Republicans, there's large excitement that we want to keep Trump in. because he's going to protect us, but B, those evil Democrats. And then vice versa, there's viewed as a huge difference between Democrats and not being able to deal with 4 more years of Trump. Here's turnout in recent election in selected countries. So year of kind of an election, and then the percent of voter turnout. So if we look at Canada, in the last federal election, there was 68.5% of people who were eligible to vote actually voted. And so then you see some, like in Argentina, there was 80.9, which is quite good. Greece, 55.2, which is quite low. Japan, 53. So you see Switzerland, 48.4, although Switzerland votes quite frequently, so that can explain that to a certain extent. Netherlands, 81.6. So you definitely see kind of this wide range of most, other than a couple of examples of Switzerland and Japan, I think it was, well, Poland. And where was Japan? Oh no, they were above 50. So Switzerland and Poland, who are below 50, most of the rest are so above 50. So we can say the majority do participate, at least in the minimal form of voting, but also in many of them. So in Canada, right, it's around 2/3, and Canada actually compared to many others isn't doing terrible. So there's still a lot of people in democracies who are eligible to vote who often don't. Now, voting isn't the only form of political participation. So there's other ways that you can participate either other than, so you could not vote in but do these other things, but also you can do greater levels of political participation, so not just vote, but also get involved in other ways in the process. Only a small proportion of the public is actively involved in politics through working for a party or candidate during an election. So in terms of getting involved in terms of working for a political party or working for a candidate and trying to help them get elected, that's only a very, very small percentage of the population. And in general, actually, membership in political parties has been declining in many countries. So it used to be people were relatively attached to their political party. So if they're a liberal for life. If they're conservative for life. And not only would they vote for that political party, but they might actually join the political party. That's something that we see declining a lot. So people are more likely to change political parties kind of throughout their lifetime, but also less likely to, for whatever the political party of the day might be, less likely to join. They may still consistently vote for that political party, but they're not necessarily going to join that political party. Now, citizen involvement in a wide variety of issue-oriented public interest groups has been increasing. So you might not have people get involved in politics in general, but they do get involved in an environmental organization, for example, or in a labor organization that's working on political issues, or in a social justice organization. So they don't get involved in wider politics, but when it comes to a particular issue that's important to them, they get involved in some way on that particular issue. And protest has become more common in contemporary political life. So that tends to be, to a certain extent, cyclical or come at different times. So in the Vietnam era, for example, you saw protests, but then it went away quite a bit. But increasingly, and I think it's probably around to stay for a while, protest has become a more accepted and more common form of political dissent. So showing the government that you're not happy with how things are going, and rather than just, voting to try to get change, you're going to put protests, and costly protests in place to try to compel the government, even outside of an election, to make changes. So if not everybody even votes, and then much smaller percentages of the population participate in other ways, it's important to understand, how can we predict who participates? So who's most likely to get involved in the political process? So those with higher levels of education, higher incomes, and professional occupations are more likely to engage in various forms of political participation, including electoral and protest activities. So higher education, higher income, and professional occupations. And there's multiple reasons that you could see for this. So partially things like higher education gives you greater political knowledge about about different issues, about the political process, and so may make you more willing to, because of greater knowledge, may make you want to get involved more. You see the problems, you're passionate about particular issues because you've become informed on them, and you want to see change. So there's certainly an element of higher education goes with greater political knowledge. Greater political knowledge is associated with greater political participation. So there is that clear line there. There's also the more the problematic side of part of why we see higher education, higher income, and professional occupation participating more in politics is also a capacity argument. So higher education, higher income, and professional occupations are all correlated with just that higher income argument. And so if we take people who, for example, are high income and low income and have the same level of political knowledge, so maybe both are high in political knowledge, but one person is working one job and able to satisfy all of their needs. So they have weekends off, they have evenings off. Another is working 3 jobs. So they don't have evenings off, they don't have weekends off. They may have a lot of issues because of problems that they're experiencing in their life, difficulties in their lives. They may have a lot of reasons to want to become engaged in the political process. They may probably have many more demands on the political process, but they just don't have time. They don't have money to participate, right? Participation may involve giving to political campaigns. It may involve traveling to a protest. Both of those take money. Also, for example, many forms of political protest or political participation, campaigning, all of them take a lot of time. And those with lower income often have less availability, less time to devote to politics. In many countries, including Canada, women are slightly more likely to vote than men, but less likely to be involved in higher level political activities. The more voting is certainly great progress, given that, at the start of the 20th century, women couldn't vote in elections, and now we have more women voting than men. Slightly concerning to see, given that in many countries there's a lot of people not voting. Slightly concerning to see that more men have kind of given up participating in the electoral component of democracy, but encouraging to see the high levels of participation among women. What is more concerning here, though, is not seeing more women being able to be involved in higher levels of political activity. Multiple reasons, again, for this, partially a glass door phenomenon, where getting involved in kind of the higher levels of political activity is often based on who you know and based on kind of just the culture of the kind of the elites in political activities. And oftentimes those could still be old boys clubs. And so it could be harder for a woman to either get into the club or to feel welcome in the club. And then partially it's still based on kind of a sexist division of labor as well. So even in families where, say, the mother and father are both working, or husband and wife are both working, or boyfriend, girlfriend are both working, the woman is going to take disproportionate share of the housework as well. So she may work 9 to 5, they may work 9 to 5, but then she will still have the additional kind of domestic work at home. Now that's changing to a certain extent. You have more families that are equitably or relatively equitably sharing the housework, so the cooking, the cleaning, the raising children. But there still is a disproportionate amount of the work that does fall to the woman, even if she's participating equally or more so in the workforce. So if you're doing kind of work outside of the home and inside the home, it's harder to find time to participate in politics. And most membership in most types of voluntary organizations have increased in Canada. So let's look a little bit across some democracies at political participation in selected countries. So active membership in political parties is extremely low. Slightly higher, actually noticeably higher in the US compared to many of the other countries. Active member in environmental organization, again, still quite low. Political Action recently signed a petition. Political Action recently joined a boycott, or Political Action recently attended a peaceful demonstration. These are actually quite high, particularly signed a petition. Now, it may be that recently, depend on how the respondent in the survey defined recently. I actually have a lot of trouble believing those last three columns and numbers in them, just because of the way that people answer surveys. So if something, for example, participating in a peaceful demonstration, signing a petition, particularly signing a petition, which can be, an easy way to participate in politics. A lot of people, when they're answering a survey, will view that as a desirable answer, right? And there certainly is a social desirability effect in answering surveys where the respondent answers what they think the survey respondent either wants them to say, so that they look good to the survey respondent, or what they think is socially desirable to say. What are they expected to say? What is good? So in kind of these relatively, you can't really hide if you're an active member of a political party. We get the role, kind of the, we can see, we don't have to go to a survey to check that. We can see how many members are there in each political parties. We could talk to environmental organizations and see their active membership, find out how many people are involved. The rest of these are more related to survey responses. And particularly when it comes to recently signed a petition, I wouldn't be surprised if you have a lot of people say they recently signed a petition, but haven't. Now let's look at young adults and their voting behavior, their political participation. Because young adults are one of the most sought after groups when it comes to political participation, and particularly electoral politics, because they're much less likely currently to vote and participate in elections than middle-aged and older adults. And so there's a lot of interest in understanding younger voters because they're viewed as an untapped resource. Many different political parties will be like, hey, if we can get that young vote to turn out, then we could win. So you'll have some parties who are trying to just mobilize the younger voters, being like, if we can tap into this massive, massive portion of the population that don't vote, we could win in a landslide. But then you have other political parties who look at it and say, young voters just are not turning out to vote. We're going to tailor policies towards middle-aged and older voters, and this could be actually very problematic for younger voters because it means that their voices just aren't being heard, or their interests just aren't being taken into account, because political parties are saying whatever we do to younger voters are not likely to turn out, but the middle-aged and older voters, if we don't put in place policies, if we don't, if we don't cater to their needs, they will punish us. So let's make sure we cater to their needs, and younger voters, it's not as important to take their interests into account. That could be very, very problematic. Now, what's interesting is, so although younger adults are less likely to vote and participate in elections, they are more likely to discuss politics, work with others on a community issue, and be active in protest. So on the protest side of politics, and in terms of actively discussing politics, young people are actually more involved. But when it comes kind of to the normal, formal avenues of political participation, are less involved. So why do so few people vote? A couple of different kind of explanations. So one is life cycle effect. And so this is kind of just looking across time. So looking across different generations and different decades, there's always been some level of um, diminished participation for younger voters. So kind of voting or participation in election typically kind of increases um, across time as you age. And this has been a phenomenon that's existed across decades. So the older you get, the more likely you are to participate. It could be for multiple reasons. It could be just an increasing, as you get older, you understand more how politics affects your day-to-day lives. It could be that you just get into, once you get into kind of your career, you get kind of socialized into the voting element is just kind of part of your responsibility as a working adult. It could be that by the time you're middle aged, you have crystallized political preferences. So voting is easier because you know who you want to vote for, but there's still uncertainty and potentially dissatisfaction with younger voters. So they haven't kind of gotten into the habit or don't have that crystallized preferences yet. So voting is more difficult. There's a lot of different factors that can lead into this life cycle effect, but across generations, we typically see younger people voting less. But there's also seems to be a generational effect because across generations, that divide is increasing. So generations ago, we still saw, so say 50, 60 years ago, we still saw that younger people voted less than older people, but the divide is increasing across generations. So as time goes on, the divide between young and old is growing. That is potentially the more concerning element. Um, that we're getting kind of this generational effect where each generation, and in politics, we see generational effects, different generations based on what's important or what's happening at, during their formative years will impact their political views. So you'll have kind of a generational political culture. Um, so that in itself isn't a problem. What is more problematic is that we see that there's generational effect when it comes to voting, and it seems to be progressing in a less participatory direction. An important element in being able to participate in politics is having political knowledge and interest. So being interested in participating or being interested in politics and being knowledgeable about political issues and which political parties will be able to respond or put in place policies that fit your interests. And as we talked a little bit about in past classes, political knowledge is typically very low. So too is political interest. So a fairly small minority of the population in many Western democracies is very interested in politics. So if you ask most people, and this, whether they really have much interest in participating in politics or in discussing politics, other than possibly a few kind of key issues that they're interested in, most of the time people would rather discuss other things or think about other things. This will change kind of with time, right? So before a particular salient election, interest in politics may go up, or right after a salient political event, interest in politics may go up as there's excitement over that particular incident or upcoming event. But then we'll typically return to quite low levels on the day-to-day operation. Although the level of political knowledge is generally low, many people are knowledgeable about political issues that are important to them. So it kind of fits the pattern that we've been seeing where participation is very low, but many people participate kind of in that one or two issue area that they really care about. And we see that a lot just with political interest or in political knowledge more widely, that people, if you ask them kind of questions about politics in general, their scores would be terribly, terribly low, but they are fairly knowledgeable about a subset of issues that's important to them. So it could be, for example, they're really into climate change. So they're knowledgeable about climate change politics or about the kind of the issues around climate change, but not about politics in general. Or it could be something trade. So they work in an industry that's been affected a lot by trade policy. So they're quite knowledgeable about trade negotiations, about trade politics, but not really about the general political process more widely. In a 2004 poll taken in Canada, showed that only 33% of people knew the name of the leader of the opposition. One third could name the leader of the opposition in Canada. Think about, are you able to tell me which party's in opposition right now and who the leader is? 60% lack the basic knowledge about Canada required of immigrants for citizenship. So there's a citizenship test in most democracies that if you're an immigrant and you want to become a citizen, there's a certain test that you need to be able to take, kind of about the political system, political ideals, and stuff like that. So about the country itself. And so only 60% of people, if we look at citizens, and so not just immigrants, but largely actually people who were born here, and we asked them to take the same test that immigrants are expected to take, only 40% of them would pass the test, and 60% would fail, which is slightly unfair, I suppose, to immigrants, that they're being held to a higher bar of knowledge about the country than others, but also incredibly depressing that people aren't better educated in the country about politics. And the majority of Canadians do not know the position of political parties on important issues during election campaigns. This can also be very problematic in that, if you don't know the issues of different political parties on important issues, then it's hard for you to make an informed decision about which political party you would like to support. You may actually support a political party that whose positions aren't actually closest to your own on issues that are important to you. Now, the better side here may be that, so a majority of Canadians may not know the position of political parties on important issues during the campaign, but they may know about the issues of political parties on the one or two issues that they're going to vote on. So that may be possible, but still in general, if you asked most Canadians what's the difference between a liberal, conservative, or NDP policy on this issue, they wouldn't be able to tell you. So we do see, when we're looking at kind of political culture within the country, jumped ahead a little bit there. So political socialization and changing values. So how is it that people learn kind of their political culture, their political ideology, their political values? So we looked already at kind of the ideology side from a psychological perspective. So from a psychology perspective, why do people have kind of their political values that they do? But we're also going to look at the political socialization side, so kind of the external influences. And the entire next class will be devoted to that, but just kind of quickly, so political socialization is the process by which the values, attitudes, and beliefs of the political culture are transmitted to members of the political community. So how is it that new members of the community learn what are the values, attitudes, and beliefs? Agents of political socialization, so those who socialize others, include the family, peer groups, educational system, the media, religious organizations, military, unions, and the workplace. So there's multiple different groups that can help socialize, that can help shape your attitudes. One of the most important would obviously be family, because children, for children, that's the most important context that you have early in your life. Peer groups too, so the friends that you hang out with. School, so we learn a lot about how the world works and kind of the values of the country right from within education. Media, religious organizations, workplace, so from your job, all of these can help shape your political views. Family is typically viewed as the most important source of socialization, but it's more complicated than just kind of parents teaching children. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next time. State-directed socialization. And so this is the extent to which state institutions make deliberate efforts to promote particular political values. And it's an attribute more strongly associated with revolutionary regimes or with authoritarian regimes who try to instill a particular political culture. This is something that ideally we wouldn't want to be having in liberal democracies, too much of the government telling or deliberately putting in efforts to promote particular political values, because it should be allowing kind of discourse to shape those values. But to a certain extent, we're likely to still see it. So American school system created a common sense of being American among a diverse immigrant population. So for example, it's not uncommon for countries to try to direct kind of a sense of national pride, right? So support for kind of the patriotic political culture. So that's not uncommon for governments to direct state resources towards that. But also we see sometimes the educational system being used. So governments do shape the curriculum that you have in, throughout your schooling, particularly elementary and high school. They would shape the curriculum that you would have and direct what textbooks are being used in high school to teach you history, for example. So there is some element of state-directed socialization. If you present one textbook versus another, you're going to be presenting different portraits of the nation's history and how it developed. So for example, in the US, right, how are you teaching slavery, right? If you have a textbook that teaches that slavery wasn't much of a problem or wasn't very common versus a textbook that takes a very critical look at not just slavery, but race relations in the development of the United States. If you have these two different textbooks coming into your school, you're likely to be socialized in a different way, to have different beliefs, to form a different culture, depending on which of these different books you saw. So we do see some elements of state-directed socialization in terms of how the history of the country is portrayed, what events are taught as important and which events are taught as not important. So that is one area of state-directed socialization that we see across from democracies to non-democracies. Typically, it'll be less severe in democracies, but not absent. So education as a source of patriotic socialization has reemerged in recent years, particularly in relation to worries about immigration and homegrown terrorism. So we certainly have seen an increase in the kind of patriotic socialization. There are changing values when we talk about political culture involves kind of a sense of what are the values, political values in a state. And we have seen kind of value change across generations in the last few generations, particularly since the end of World War II. So modern societies are undergoing a fundamental change in value priorities. And a lot of this relates to a growth kind of post-materialism. And this is the argument that non-material values such as freedom of expression, participation, quality of life, and the environment are given greater priority by those that grew up in relative security and affluence since World War II. So arguably for the first time in human history, after World War II, those in many of kind of the Western countries reached a level of physical and economic security and affluence, so level of wealth, where they trusted that they didn't have to really worry much about their physical security and their economic security. They knew that they had enough money coming in to satisfy their basic needs. And so they could start focusing their attention and their energy on other concerns. In past time, so things, for example, like quality of life, could start caring about political issues that affected quality of life. Before World War II, there was almost no time in human history where people could be sure enough about just having enough food on the table or having enough goods that they could really worry about anything other than just satisfying their material needs. It takes a certain level of wealth before you can start putting kind of the priority on non-material values. So kind of these ideals of freedom of expression, quality of life, looking out for the environment, so putting effort into that. Earlier generations are more likely to have materialist values, such as a concern for economic growth, order, and physical security. That comes out of their experiences where these were things that weren't taken for granted, or weren't not necessarily taken for granted, but weren't givens. They weren't facts of life, where these are more of facts of life for generations since World War II. And when they're not facts of life, then they're not your ultimate concern. In addition to post-materialism, other factors that have contributed to changing value priorities include the development of a post-industrial knowledge-based economy, greater access to higher education, and more effective means of mass communication. So these have all affected changing value priorities. So our entire economy has changed. So most people now actually work in the, not in producing goods, but actually in the service industry. So there's been a fundamental change in the organization of the economy, where most people aren't producing anything, they're providing services. Knowledge-based economy, through greater access to higher education, so people are more educated than they were in the past. So that leads to greater demand, more access to information through mass communications and changes in communication technology. All of these have helped produce changing political values. New style of citizen politics, so a set of changes including greater citizen activism, the questioning of authority, the development of new political parties and new social movements, and development of more liberal social values. So more liberal in terms of, so not necessarily in terms of liberal, where we talk liberalism about greater individual freedom, but more about liberal social values in terms of greater equality. So nobody should be left out. Everybody should have access into the system and be able to participate fairly. Questioning of authority. So we saw kind of greater tendency toward protest now. And part of that comes with the greater questioning of authority, not just accepting what politicians are saying, but questioning it. And if politicians don't do what you want, getting actively involved in protest, in activism, in campaigning. Part of the greater question of authority comes slightly from this post-materialism, so greater time to be worried about other things, partially from greater information access from more mass media and social media, and then partially higher education, so better understanding of the political process. Now, I don't want to overstate the importance of this post-materialism. So yes, people are more focused on these other issues, environmentalism, and yes, quality of life is something that's certainly very important. So not just do I have enough food on the table, but how comfortable am I? And yes, all of these things have definitely continued to grow since the end of World War II. Still though, if we look at most elections, at the end of the day, when people end up voting for parties, they've got all of these different things that they say are really, really important to them, from the environment and equality and civil rights and you know, all of these different things. But at the end of the day, many elections end up being pocketbook elections. So people vote the economy at the end of the day. In many, many elections, if you end up looking at what was the dominant determinant of vote, particularly in the States. Canada could be a little bit more diverse. We've certainly had healthcare elections and stuff like that, but the economy across democracies still is often ends up being the most important issue. So in that sense, questions that, you know, we may say a lot of things are important to us, and yes, there has been some changes in voting behavior and some changes in protest activity and political activism. But at the end of the day, if voting is still one of the most important forms of political participation, if we look at the ultimate determinant of political participation or voting, it's often the economy that plays the largest role. So this whole kind of transformation to a post-materialist economy and post-materialist, or sometimes put as postmodern politics is important. We don't want to overstate it too. All right, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the lecture, and on Thursday we'll continue with political socialization.